Greetings, 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 greetings. Peace be unto you. Greetings and welcome back once again. This is a moment Yisrael. Solonomics, Left Project Special. We here in the building on time 2 days in a row, turning up 2 days in a row. We're going to try to do 2 chapters today. For those who just joined us, this is the listening party, the listening event. It's not a party, but it's an event of Uncle Tom's Cabin. We're making our way through it. It's an interesting narrative. Just to recap, the thought is that this was written back in mid 1850s, before the Civil War. It was a bestseller, second only to the Bible. Um, Reached many households and ears and eyes of people. It started a discussion and it shaped stereotypes. So I personally have not read Uncle Tom's Cabin, so this is a first for you and I. And just to catch up on what is going on in the narrative, Shelby, let me see if I can remember all these names, get all these names straight. Shelby the slave trader. No, Shelby's not the slave trader. The slave master who was supposed to be a good Christian, got himself in financial bind, had to sell his best hand, which is Uncle Tom. Um, and he threw in as a bonus, okay, um, Eliza's son. What's her son name again? Y'all help me out. Eliza's son, Henry, I think his name is. And when Eliza got wind of it, which was also one of his best hands, his wife's handmaiden, she ran off with the child. The slave trader is on there behind. He he got to where she was, but he missed her because she darted across the frozen lake. And now he has hired some slave catchers to catch her so that they can retrieve the child. And so they're plotting, they scheming into how they're going to retrieve the child and then sell her down south in New Orleans. And we have Sam, quote unquote, Black Sam, who now sees an opportunity that his fellow enslaved brother, which is Uncle Tom, is going to be shipped off. So he's jockeying for position. So that's where we're at right now. And we are going to pick up, that's a lot. I'm trying to remember all the names and everything. We are going to pick up on chapter 9. All righty.
Chapter 9, in which it appears that a senator is but a man. The light of the cheerful fire shone on the rug and carpet of a cozy parlor and glittered on the sides of the teacups and well-brightened teapot as Senator Byrd was drawing off his boots, preparatory to inserting his feet in a pair of new handsome slippers, which his wife had been working for him while away on his senatorial tour. Mrs. Byrd, looking the very picture of delight, was superintending the arrangements of the table, ever and anon mingling admonitory remarks to a number of frolicsome juveniles who were effervescing in all those modes of untold gambol and mischief that have astonished mothers ever since the flood. "Tom, let the doorknob alone. There's a man. Mary, don't pull the cat's tail. Poor pussy. Jim, you mustn't climb on that table. No. You don't know, my dear, what a surprise it is to us all to see you here tonight," said she at last, when she found a space to say something to her husband. Yes, I thought I'd just make a run down, spend the night, and have a little comfort at home. I'm tired to death, and my head aches." Mrs. Byrd cast a glance at a camphor bottle, which stood in the half-open closet, and appeared to meditate an approach to it, but her husband interposed. No, Mary, no doctoring. A cup of your good hot tea and some of our good home living is what I want. It's a tiresome business, this legislating. And the senator smiled, as if he rather liked the idea of considering himself a sacrifice to his country. "Well," said his wife, after the business of the tea-table was getting rather slack, "and what have they been doing in the Senate?" Now, it was a very unusual thing for gentle little Mrs. Byrd ever to trouble her head with what was going on in the House of the State, very wisely considering that she had enough to do to mind her own. Mr. Byrd therefore opened his eyes in surprise and said, "Not very much of importance." "Well, but is it true that they have been passing a law forbidding people to give meat and drink to those poor colored folks that come along? I heard they were talking of some such law, but I didn't think any Christian legislature would pass it." "Why, Mary, You are getting to be a politician all at once. No, nonsense. I wouldn't give a flip for all your politics generally, but I think this is something downright cruel and unchristian. I hope, my dear, no such law has been passed. There has been a law passed forbidding people to help off the slaves that come over from Kentucky, my dear. So much of that thing has been done by these reckless abolitionists that our brethren in Kentucky are very strongly excited, and it seems necessary, and no more than Christian and kind, that something should be done by our state to quiet the excitement. And what is the law? It don't forbid us to shelter those poor creatures a night, does it? And to give 'em something comfortable to eat and a few old clothes, and send them quietly about their business? Why, yes, my dear, that would be aiding and abetting, you know. Mrs. Bird was a timid, blushing little woman of about 4 feet in height, and with mild blue eyes and a peach-blow complexion and the gentlest, sweetest voice in the world. As for courage, a moderate-sized cock turkey had been known to put her to rout at the very first gobble, and a stout house-dog of moderate capacity would bring her into subjection merely by a show of his teeth. Her husband and children were her entire world, and in these she ruled more by entreaty and persuasion than by command or argument. There was only one thing that was capable of arousing her, and that provocation came in on the side of her unusually gentle and sympathetic nature. Anything in the shape of cruelty would throw her into a passion, which was the more alarming and inexplicable in proportion to the general softness of her nature. Generally the most indulgent and easy to be entreated of all mothers, still her boys had a very reverent remembrance of a most vehement chastisement she once bestowed on them, because she found them leagued with several graceless boys of the neighborhood, stoning a defenseless kitten. "I'll tell you what," Master Bill used to say, "I was scared that time. Mother came at me so that I thought she was crazy, and I was whipped and tumbled off to bed, without any supper, before I could get over wondering what had come about. And after that, I heard Mother crying outside the door, which made me feel worse than all the rest. I'll tell you what," he'd say, "we boys never stoned another kitten." On the present occasion, Mrs. Bird rose quickly, with very red cheeks, which quite improved her general appearance, and walked up to her husband with quite a resolute air, and said, in a determined tone, "Now, John, I want to know if you think such a law as that is right and Christian." "You won't shoot me now, Mary, if I say I do." "I never could have thought it of you, John. You didn't vote for it?" "Even so, my fair politician." "You ought to be ashamed, John. Poor, homeless, houseless creatures. It's a shameful, wicked, abominable law, and I'll break it, for one, the first time I get a chance, and I hope I shall have a chance, I do. Things have got to a pretty pass if a woman can't give a warm supper and a bed to poor, starving creatures just because they are slaves, and have been abused and oppressed all their lives, poor things. But, Mary, just listen to me. Your feelings are all quite right, dear, and interesting, and I love you for them. But then, dear, we mustn't suffer our feelings to run away with our judgment. You must consider it's a matter of private feeling. There are great public interests involved. There is such a state of public agitation rising that we must put aside our private feelings. Now, John, I don't know anything about politics, but I can read my Bible, and there I see that I must feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and comfort the desolate, and that Bible I mean to follow. But in cases where your doing so would involve a great public evil, obeying God never brings on public evils. I know it can't. It's always safest all around to do as He bids us. Now listen to me, Mary, and I can state to you a very clear argument to show—" "Oh, nonsense, John. You can talk all night, but you wouldn't do it. I put it to you, John, would you now turn away a poor, shivering, hungry creature from your door because he was a runaway? Would you now?" Now, if the truth must be told, our senator had the misfortune to be a man who had a particularly humane and accessible nature, and turning away anybody that was in trouble never had been his forte. And what was worse for him in this particular pinch of the argument was that his wife knew it, and, of course, was making an assault on rather an indefensible point. So he had recourse to the usual means of gaining time for such cases made and provided. He said, "Ahem," and coughed several times, took out his pocket-handkerchief and began to wipe his glasses, Mrs. Bird, seeing the defenseless condition of the enemy's territory, had no more conscience than to push her advantage. I should like to see you doing that, John. I really should. Turning a woman out of doors in a snowstorm, for instance. Or maybe you'd take her up and put her in jail, wouldn't you? You would make a great hand at that. Of course, it would be a very painful duty, began Mr. Bird in a moderate tone. Duty, John? Don't use that word. You know it isn't a duty. It can't be a duty. If folks want to keep their slaves from running away, let 'em treat 'em well. That's my doctrine. If I had slaves, as I hope I never shall have, I'd risk their wanting to run away from me, or you either, John. I tell you, folks don't run away when they are happy, and when they do run, poor creatures, they suffer enough with cold and hunger and fear without everybody's turning against them, and law or no law, I never will, so help me God. Mary, Mary, my dear, let me reason with you. I hate reasoning, John, especially reasoning on such subjects. There's a way you political folks have of coming round and round a plain right thing, and you don't believe in it yourselves when it comes to practice. I know you well enough, John. You don't believe it's right any more than I do, and you wouldn't do it any sooner than I. At this critical juncture, old Cudjoe, the black man of all work, put his head in at the door and wished Mrs. would come into the kitchen, and our senator, tolerably relieved, looked after his little wife with a whimsical mixture of amusement and vexation, and, seating himself in the armchair, began to read the papers. After a moment his wife's voice was heard at the door in a quick, earnest tone. John, John, I do wish you'd come here a moment. He laid down his paper and went into the kitchen and started, quite amazed at the sight that presented itself. A young and slender woman, with garments torn and frozen, with one shoe gone, and the stocking torn away from the cut and bleeding foot, was laid back in a deadly swoon upon two chairs. There was the impress of the despised race on her face, yet none could help feeling its mournful and pathetic beauty, while its stony sharpness, its cold, fixed, deathly aspect, struck a solemn chill over him. He drew his breath short and stood in silence. His wife and their only colored domestic, old Aunt Dinah, were busily engaged in restorative measures, while old Cudjoe had got the boy on his knee and was busy pulling off his shoes and stockings and chafing his little cold feet. Sure now, if she ain't a sight to behold, said old Dinah compassionately. 'Pears like 'twas the heat that made her faint. She was tolerable pert when she come in, and asked if she couldn't warm herself here a spell, and I was just a-asking her where she come from, and she fainted right down. Never done much hard work, guess, by the looks of her hands. Poor creature, said Mrs. Bird compassionately, as the woman slowly unclosed her large dark eyes and looked vacantly at her. Suddenly an expression of agony crossed her face, and she sprang up, saying, Oh, my Harry, have they got him? The boy, at this, jumped from Cudjoe's knee, and running to her side, put up his arms. Oh, he's here, she exclaimed. Oh, ma'am, she said wildly to Mrs. Bird, do protect us. Don't let them get him. Nobody shall hurt you here, poor woman, said Mrs. Bird encouragingly. You are safe. Don't be afraid. God bless you, said the woman, covering her face and sobbing, while the little boy, seeing her crying, tried to get into her lap. With many gentle and womanly offices, which none knew better how to render than Mrs. Bird, the poor woman was in time rendered more calm. A temporary bed was provided for her on a settle near the fire, and, after a short time, she fell into a heavy slumber, with a child, who seemed no less weary, soundly sleeping on her arm. For the mother resisted with nervous anxiety the kindest attempts to take him from her, and even in sleep her arm encircled him with an unrelaxing clasp, as if she could not even then be beguiled of her vigilant hold.
All right, all right, all right. For those who just joined us, this is Amuna. We are listening to Chapter 9 of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Um, so if you missed a little bit, you didn't miss that much. The senator is a new character and his wife introduced. They was going back and forth about what fugitive slave laws essentially is what was happening as abolition increased and they were getting more traction. They kept going back to the house and back to the lawmakers and making laws on the fly. And so for these fugitive slave laws are what they're discussing in the book and how they began to chastise European people for aiding melanated people. So even you'll see that in the reading. If you teach a melanated person to read, then the European person will either be whipped or they will be fined. If you find harboring and abetting, then these are the things because they were trying to discourage aiding those who were looking to run away. And that tells us that you did have people on the other side who did not agree with the institution of slavery and who were willing to buck the system to do what they felt was right in their heart. I mean, it's just historical facts. So it's Eliza, essentially, who is talking right now, who ended up stumbling into the house. Remember, she went to the riverbank, and the man said he has somewhere that she could go, and this is the house that she turns up on. So let's continue to listen.
Mr. and Mrs. Bird had gone back to the parlor where, strange as it may appear, no reference was made on either side to the preceding conversation. But Mrs. Bird busied herself with her knitting work, and Mr. Bird pretended to be reading the paper. "I wonder who and what she is," said Mr. Bird at last, as he laid it down. "When she wakes up and feels a little rested, we will see," said Mrs. Bird. "I say, wife," said Mr. Bird after musing in silence over his newspaper. "Well, dear?" "She couldn't wear one of your gowns, could she, by any letting down or such matter? She seems to be rather larger than you are." A quite perceptible smile glimmered on Mrs. Bird's face as she answered, "We'll see." Another pause, and Mr. Bird again broke out, "I say, wife." "Well, what now?" "Why, there's that old bombazin cloak that you keep on purpose to put over me when I take my afternoon's nap. You might as well give her that. She needs clothes." At this instant Dinah looked in to say that the woman was awake and wanted to see Mrs. Mr. and Mrs. Bird went into the kitchen, followed by the two eldest boys, the smaller fry having by this time been safely disposed of in bed. The woman was now sitting up on the settle by the fire. She was looking steadily into the blaze with a calm, heartbroken expression, very different from her former agitated wildness. "Did you want me?" said Mrs. Bird in gentle tones. "I hope you feel better now, poor woman." A long-drawn, shivering sigh was the only answer, but she lifted her dark eyes and fixed them on her with such a forlorn and imploring expression that the tears came into the little woman's eyes. "You needn't be afraid of anything. We are friends here, poor woman. Tell me where you came from and what you want," said she. "I came from Kentucky," said the woman. "When?" said Mr. Bird, taking up the interrogatory. "Tonight." "How did you come?" "I crossed on the ice." "Crossed on the ice," said every one present. "Yes," said the woman slowly, "I did. God helping me, I crossed on the ice, for they were behind me, right behind, and there was no other way." "Law, missus," said Cudjoe, "the ice is all in broken-up blocks, a-swinging and a-teetering up and down the river." "I know it was, I know it," said she wildly, "but I did it. I wouldn't have thought I could. I didn't think I could get over, but I didn't care. I could but die if I didn't. The Lord helped me. Nobody knows how much the Lord can help 'em till they try," said the woman with a flashing eye. "Were you a slave?" said Mr. Bird. "Yes, sir. I belonged to a man in Kentucky." "Was he unkind to you?" "No, sir. He was a good master." "And was your mistress unkind to you?" "No, sir, no. My mistress was always good to me." "What could induce you to leave a good home, then, and run away and go through such dangers?" The woman looked up at Mrs. Bird with a keen, scrutinizing glance, and it did not escape her that she was dressed in deep mourning. "Ma'am," she said suddenly, "have you ever lost a child?" The question was unexpected, and it was thrust on a new wound, for it was only a month since a darling child of the family had been laid in the grave. Mr. Bird turned around and walked to the window, and Mrs. Bird burst into tears, but, recovering her voice, she said, "Why do you ask that? I have lost a little one." "Then you will feel for me. I have lost two, one after another, left 'em buried there when I came away, and I had only this one left. I never slept a night without him. He was all I had. He was my comfort and pride, day and night, and, ma'am, they were going to take him away from me, to sell him Sell him down south, ma'am, to go all alone, a baby that had never been away from his mother in his life. I couldn't stand it, ma'am. I knew I never should be good for anything if they did, and when I knew the papers were signed, and he was sold, I took him and came off in the night, and they chased me, the man that brought him, and some of Massa's folks, and they were coming down right behind me, and I heard 'em. I jumped right onto the ice, and how I got across, I don't know. But first I knew a man was helping me up the bank." The woman did not sob nor weep. She had gone to a place where tears are dry. But every one around her was, in some way characteristic of themselves, showing signs of hearty sympathy. The two little boys, after a desperate rummaging in their pockets in search of those pocket handkerchiefs which mothers know are never to be found there, had thrown themselves disconsolately into the skirts of their mother's gown, where they were sobbing and wiping their eyes and noses to their heart's content. Mrs. Bird had her face fairly hidden in her pocket handkerchief, and old Dinah, with tears streaming down her black, honest face, was ejaculating, "Lord have mercy on us," with all the fervor of a camp meeting, while old Cudjoe, rubbing his eyes very hard with his cuffs, and making a most uncommon variety of wry faces, occasionally responded in the same key with great fervor. Our senator was a statesman, and of course could not be expected to cry, like other mortals, and so he turned his back to the company and looked out of the window, and seemed particularly busy in clearing his throat and wiping his spectacle glasses, occasionally blowing his nose in a manner that was calculated to excite suspicion had anyone been in a state to observe critically. "How came you to tell me you had a kind master?" he suddenly exclaimed, gulping down very resolutely some kind of rising in his throat, and turning suddenly round upon the woman. "Because he was a kind master, I'll say that of him anyway, and my mistress was kind, but they couldn't help themselves. They were owing money, and there was some way, I can't tell how, that a man had a hold on them, and they were obliged to give him his will. I listened, and heard him telling mistress that, and she begging and pleading for me, and he told her he couldn't help himself, and that the papers were all drawn, and then it was I took him and left my home and came away. I knew 'twas no use of my trying to live if they did it, for it appears like this child is all I have." "Have you no husband?" "Yes, but he belongs to another man. His master is real hard to him, and won't let him come to see me hardly ever, and he's grown harder and harder upon us, and he threatens to sell him down south. It's like I'll never see him again." The quiet tone in which the woman pronounced these words might have led a superficial observer to think that she was entirely apathetic, but there was a calm, settled depth of anguish in her large, dark eye that spoke of something far otherwise. "And where do you mean to go, my poor woman?" said Mrs. Bird. "To Canada, if I only knew where that was. Is it very far off, is Canada?" said she, looking up with a simple, confiding air to Mrs. Bird's face. "Poor thing," said Mrs. Bird involuntarily. "Ist a very great way off, think?" said the woman earnestly. "Much further than you think, poor child," said Mrs. Bird. "But we will try to think what can be done for you. Here, Dinah, make her up a bed in your own room, close by the kitchen, and I'll think what to do for her in the morning. Meanwhile, never fear, poor woman. Put your trust in God. He will protect you." Mrs. Bird and her husband re-entered the parlor. She sat down in her little rocking chair before the fire, swaying thoughtfully to and fro. Mr. Bird strode up and down the room, grumbling to himself. "Pish! Pshaw! Confounded awkward business!" At length, striding up to his wife, he said, "I say, wife, she'll have to get away from here this very night. That fellow will be down on the scent bright and early tomorrow morning. If 'twas only the woman, she could lie quiet till it was over. But that little chap can't be kept still by a troop of horse and foot, I'll warrant me. He'll bring it all out, popping his head out of some window or door. A pretty kettle of fish it would be for me, too, to be caught with them both here just now. No, they'll have to be got off tonight." "Tonight? How is it possible? Where to?" "Well, I know pretty well where to," said the senator, beginning to put on his boots with a reflective air, and stopping when his leg was half in, he embraced his knee with both hands and seemed to go off in deep meditation. "It's a confounded awkward, ugly business," said he at last, beginning to tug at his bootstraps again, "and that's a fact." After one boot was fairly on, the senator sat with the other in his hand, profoundly studying the figure of the carpet. "It will have to be done, though, for aught I see. Hang it all!" And he drew the other boot anxiously on and looked out of the window. Now, little Mrs. Bird was a discreet woman, a woman.
All right, all right. Hold on, hold on. I just had to stop a little bit for those who just joined us. It seems that the senator is experiencing a bit of cognitive dissonance, where, yeah, the husband is shaky because he's a senator. So there are many times where they're living these dual lives. They're having cognitive dissonance, holding these two opposing thoughts at the same time. Like he said to his wife, well, those seem to be private thoughts because it's kind of like today's space and time, wherever the social norm is, even if you don't agree with it, you may feel apprehensive about expressing that in the public because of the backlash that you may receive. Like in today's space and time, if you say, I don't agree with certain lifestyles, because that now has become a social norm. When you say those things, people lash out on you and they come for you. And so this is kind of the same thing that was happening with slavery in their private spaces. People were saying, listen, I don't agree with the European people who didn't own slaves, because not every European person owned slaves or could afford to. And they were not in agreement, but because the dominant society, the majority, especially in the South, were proponents of this institution, they couldn't really express that. So that conversation we're hearing between him and his wife is like, "Come on, what are you really doing?" And so that very discussion that they were having, just at the time that Eliza is coming to the door, it gives an opportunity for him to show his cards or show his hand or what he's really about. And so his thoughts is like, if I get caught with the runaway in my house, and there is laws now that are being passed, and I was just sitting there saying that if you get caught, you're gonna get in trouble. I gotta get her out of here. And so he's basically saying he knows a place. She can't stay here because he doesn't want to be caught, but he knows a place that she can go. And so that's kind of what is going. He's like, yo, we gotta go tonight, you know. So that's kind of what's happening. Because I guess in this time, the more flowery the language, you know what I mean, the more, I don't know, but she uses a whole lot of flowery, potpourri type language. That's a bit unnecessary, but hey, it was the time, right? So that's where we are right now. So let's see what's going
Who never in her life said, "I told you so," and on the present occasion, though pretty well aware of the shape her husband's meditations were taking, she very prudently forbore to meddle with them, only sat very quietly in her chair, and looked quite ready to hear her liege lord's intentions when he should think proper to utter them. "You see," he said, "there's my old client, Van Tromp, who's come over from Kentucky and set all his slaves free, and he has bought a place 7 miles up the creek here, back in the woods, where nobody goes unless they go on purpose, and it's a place that isn't found in a hurry. There she'd be safe enough, but the plague of the thing is, nobody could drive a carriage there tonight but me." "Why not? Cudjoe is an excellent driver." Aye, but here it is. The creek has to be crossed twice, and the second crossing is quite dangerous, unless one knows it as I do. I have crossed it 100 times on horseback and know exactly the turns to take. And so, you see, there's no help for it. Cudjoe must put in the horses, as quietly as may be, about 12 o'clock, and I'll take her over, and then, to give color to the matter, he must carry me on to the next tavern to take the stage for Columbus, that comes by about 3 or 4, and so it will look as if I had had the carriage only for that. I shall get into business bright and early in the morning, but I'm thinking I shall feel rather cheap there, after all that's been said and done, but hang it, I can't help it." "Your heart is better than your head in this case, John," said the wife, laying her little white hand on his. "Could I ever have loved you had I not known you better than you know yourself?" And the little woman looked so handsome, with the tears sparkling in her eyes, that the senator thought he must be a decidedly clever fellow to get such a pretty creature into such a passionate admiration of him. And so, what could he do but walk off somberly to see about the carriage? At the door, however, he stopped a moment, and then, coming back, he said, with some hesitation, "Mary, I don't know how you'd feel about it, but there's that drawer full of things of poor little Henry's." So saying, he turned quickly on his feet and shut the door after him. His wife opened the little bedroom door adjoining her room, and, taking the candle, set it down on top of a bureau there. Then from a small recess she took a key, and put it thoughtfully in the lock of a drawer, and made a sudden pause, while two boys, who, boy-like, had followed close on her heels, stood looking, with silent, significant glances, at their mother. And oh, mother that reads this, has there never been in your house a drawer or a closet, the opening of which has been to you like the opening again of a little grave? Ah, happy mother that you are, if it has not been so. Mrs. Bird slowly opened the drawer. There were little coats of many a form and pattern, piles of aprons, and rows of small stockings, and even a pair of little shoes, worn and rubbed at the toes, that were peeping from the folds of a paper. There was a toy horse and a wagon, a top, a ball, memorials gathered with many a tear and many a heartbreak. She sat down by the drawer, and leaning her head on her hands over it, wept till the tears fell through her fingers into the drawer. Then suddenly raising her head, she began, with nervous haste, selecting the plainest and most substantial articles, and gathering them into a bundle. "Mamma," said one of the boys, gently touching her arm, "you going to give away those things?" "My dear boys," she said, softly and earnestly, "if our dear, loving little Henry looks down from heaven, he would be glad to have us do this. I could not find it in my heart to give them away to any common person, to anybody that was happy, but I give them to a mother more heartbroken and sorrowful than I am, and I hope God will send his blessings with them." There are in this world blessed souls, whose sorrows all spring up into joys for others, whose earthly hopes, laid in the grave with many tears, are the seed from which spring healing flowers and balm for the desolate and the distressed. Among such was the delicate woman who sits there by the lamp, dropping slow tears, while she prepares the memorials of her own lost one for the outcast wanderer. After a while Mrs. Bird opened a wardrobe, and taking from thence a plain, serviceable dress or two, sat down busily to her work-table, and, with needle, scissors, and thimble at hand, quietly commenced the letting down process which her husband had recommended, and continued busily at it till the old clock in the corner struck 12, and she heard the low rattling of wheels at the door. "Mary," said her husband, coming in with his overcoat in his hand, "you must wake her up now. We must be off." Mrs. Bird hastily deposited the various articles she had collected in a small plain trunk, and, locking it, desired her husband to see it in the carriage, and then proceeded to call the woman. Soon, arrayed in a cloak, bonnet, and shawl that had belonged to her benefactress, she appeared at the door with her child in her arms. Mr. Bird hurried her into the carriage, and Mrs. Bird pressed on after her to the carriage steps. Eliza leaned out of the carriage and put out her hand, a hand as soft and beautiful as was given in return. She fixed her large, dark eyes, full of earnest meaning, on Mrs. Bird's face, and seemed going to speak. Her lips moved. She tried once or twice, but there was no sound, and, pointing upward, with a look never to be forgotten, she fell back in the seat and covered her face. The door was shut, and the carriage drove on. What a situation now for a patriotic senator that had been all the week before spurring up the legislature of his native state to pass more stringent resolutions against escaping fugitives, their harborers and abettors. Our good senator in his native state had not been exceeded by any of his brethren at Washington in the sort of eloquence which has won for them immortal renown. How sublimely he had sat with his hands in his pocket, and scouted all sentimental weakness of those who would put the welfare of a few miserable fugitives before great state interests. He was as bold as a lion about it, and mightily convinced, not only himself, but everybody that heard him. But then his idea of a fugitive was only an idea of the letters that spell the word, or, at the most, the image of a little newspaper picture of a man with a stick and bundle, with "ran away from the subscriber" under it. The magic of the real presence of distress The imploring human eye, the frail, trembling human hand, the despairing appeal of helpless agony, these he had never tried. He had never thought that a fugitive might be a hapless mother, a defenseless child, like that one which was now wearing his lost boy's little well-known cap. And so, as our poor senator was not stone or steel, as he was a man, and a downright noble-hearted one too, he was, as everybody must see, in a sad case for his patriotism. And you need not exult over him, good brother of the Southern States, for we have some inklings that many of you, under similar circumstances, would not do much better. We have reason to know, in Kentucky, as in Mississippi, are noble and generous hearts, to whom never was tale of suffering told in vain. Ah, good brother, is it fair for you to expect of us services which your own brave, honorable heart would not allow you to render, were you in our place? Be that as it may, if our good senator was a political sinner, he was in a fair way to expiate it by his night's penance. There had been a long continuous period of rainy weather, and the soft, rich earth of Ohio, as everyone knows, is admirably suited to the manufacture of mud, and the road was an Ohio railroad of the good old times. "And pray what sort of a road may that be?" says some Eastern traveler who has been accustomed to connect no ideas with a railroad but those of smoothness or speed. Know then, innocent Eastern friend, that in benighted regions of the West, where the mud is of unfathomable and sublime depth, roads are made of round, rough logs, arranged transversely side by side and coated over in their pristine freshness with earth, turf, and whatsoever may come to hand, and then the rejoicing native calleth it a road, and straightway essayeth to ride thereupon. In process of time, the rains wash off all the turf and grass aforesaid, move the logs hither and thither in picturesque positions, up, down, and crosswise, with divers chasms and ruts of black mud intervening. Over such a road as this our senator went stumbling along, making moral reflections as continuously as under the circumstances could be expected. The carriage proceeding along much as follows: bump, 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 slush, down in the mud. The senator, woman, and child reversing their positions so suddenly as to come, without any very accurate adjustment, against the windows of the downhill side. Carriage sticks fast, while Cudjoe on the outside is heard making a great muster among the horses. After various ineffectual pullings and twitchings, just as the senator is losing all patience, the carriage suddenly rights itself with a bounce. Two front wheels go down into another abyss, and senator, woman, and child all tumble promiscuously on to the front seat. Senator's hat is jammed over his eyes and nose quite unceremoniously, and he considers himself fairly extinguished. Child cries, and Cudjoe on the outside delivers animated addresses to the horses, who are kicking and floundering and straining under repeated cracks of the whip. Carriage springs up with another bounce, down go the hind wheels. Senator, woman, and child fly over on the back seat, his elbows encountering her bonnet, and both her feet being jammed into his hat, which flies off in the concussion.
Boy, she sure be going into some descript details about the road. For those who just joined us, welcome. We are in the latter part of chapter 9, and it's interesting just in doing this research for a few years now to see kind of the inner workings of the mind. Because when you write, that's your mind, right? So the inner workings of the mind of the European and how descriptive they are and things that they pay attention to that we may not necessarily think is of great importance. And she goes into this length of talking about the bumpiness in the road, but at the same time, she, even though she's from an abolitionist family is what we're told, she goes into great lengths of painting the European women as soft and gentle and a good natured and all of these things, right? And then when referring to a melanated person as woolly headed, dirty, black, if you listen to these descriptive words, sometimes I'm just sitting here like, okay. You know what I mean? So I say that to say it's important to understand how media, which is what books are, words, media in whatever form, shapes the mind, shapes what we see and how we see what we see. Even just listening to this 100 and something year old book and looking through her eyes, how they see what they see and how they convince us to see what we see is all laid out. So, people be like, hey man, this book was help melanated people, but at the same time disparaged melanated people. It's just wild and crazy. But I just had to say that because boy, she be going in. You notice that, right, LF? I'm like, wow, she's just going in on all of these descriptions. Um, and at this, yeah, he's so nice and genteel. And if you're mixed, if you're mulatto, then you're just good natured with a beautiful appearance. But if you're not, if you're melanated from the continent, then you're rough and it's like, wait, hold on, what's going on here? But anyway, we're gonna finish chapter 9 here. Chapter 9 is almost done.
After a few moments, the slough is past, and the horses stop, panting. The senator finds his hat, the woman straightens her bonnet and hushes her child, and they brace themselves for what is yet to come. For a while only the continuous bump, bump, intermingled just by way of variety with divers side plunges and compound shakes, and they begin to flatter themselves that they are not so badly off after all. At last, with a square plunge, which puts all onto their feet and then down into their seats with incredible quickness, the carriage stops, and after much outside commotion, Cudjoe appears at the door. "Please, sir, it's a powerful bad spot this yar. I don't know how we's to get clear out. I'm a-thinking we'll have to be getting rails." The senator despairingly steps out, picking gingerly for some firm foothold. Down goes one foot in immeasurable depth. He tries to pull it up, loses his balance, and tumbles over into the mud, and is fished out in a very despairing condition by Cudjoe. But we forbear out of sympathy to our readers' bones. Western travelers who have beguiled the midnight hour in the interesting process of pulling down rail fences to pry their carriages out of mud-holes will have a respectful and mournful sympathy with our unfortunate hero. We beg them to drop a silent tear and pass on. It was full late in the night when the carriage emerged, dripping and bespattered, out of the creek and stood at the door of a large farmhouse. It took no inconsiderable perseverance to arouse the inmates, but at last the respectable proprietor appeared and undid the door. He was a great, tall, bristling Orson of a fellow, full 6 feet and some inches in his stockings, and arrayed in a red flannel hunting shirt. A very heavy mat of sandy hair, in a decidedly tousled condition, and a beard of some days' growth, gave the worthy man an appearance, to say the least, not particularly prepossessing. He stood for a few minutes holding the candle aloft and blinking on our travelers with a dismal and mystified expression that was truly ludicrous. It cost some effort of our senator to induce him to comprehend the case fully, and while he is doing his best at that, we shall give him a little introduction to our readers. Honest old John Van Tromp was one quite a considerable landowner and slave owner in the state of Kentucky, having nothing of the bear about him but the skin, and being gifted by nature with a great, honest, just heart, quite equal to his gigantic frame. He had been for some years witnessing with repressed uneasiness the workings of a system equally bad for oppressor and oppressed. At last, one day, John's great heart had swelled altogether too big to wear his bonds any longer. So he just took his pocketbook out of his desk and went over into Ohio and bought a quarter of a township of good, rich land, made out free papers for all his people, men, women, and children, packed them up in wagons, and sent them off to settle down. And then honest John turned his face up the creek and sat quietly down on a snug, retired farm to enjoy his conscience and his reflections. "Are you the man that will shelter a poor woman and child from slave-catchers?" said the senator explicitly. "I rather think I am," said honest John, with some considerable emphasis. "I thought so," said the senator. "If there's anybody comes," said the good man, stretching his tall, muscular form upward, "why, here I'm ready for him, and I've got 7 sons, each 6 foot high, and they'll be ready for 'em. Give our respects to 'em," said John. "Tell 'em it's no matter how soon they call. Make no kinder difference to us," said John, running his fingers through the shock of hair that thatched his head and bursting out into a great laugh. Weary, jaded, and spiritless, Eliza dragged herself up to the door with her child lying in a heavy sleep on her arm. The rough man held the candle to her face, and uttering a kind of compassionate grunt, opened the door of a small bedroom adjoining to the large kitchen where they were standing, and motioned her to go in. He took down a candle, and lighting it, set it upon the table, and then addressed himself to Eliza. "Now, I say, gal, you needn't be a bit afeard. Let who will come here. I'm up to all that sort of thing," he said, pointing to 2 or 3 goodly rifles over the mantelpiece. "And most people that know me know that 'twouldn't be healthy to try to get anybody out of my house when I'm agin it. So now you just go to sleep now, as quiet as if your mother was a-rocking you," said he, as he shut the door. "Why, this is an uncommon handsome one," said he to the senator. "Ah, well, handsome uns has the greatest cause to run sometimes, if they has any kind of feeling, such as decent women should. I know all about that." The senator, in a few words, briefly explained Eliza's history. "Oh, oh, ah, now I want to know," said the good man pitifully. "Sho, now sho. That's nature now, poor critter. Hunted down now like a deer. Hunted down just for having natural feelings and doing what no kind of mother could help a-doing. I tell you what, these yer things make me come the nighest to swearing now almost anything," said honest John, as he wiped his eyes with the back of a great freckled yellow hand. "I tell you what, stranger, it was years and years before I jined the church, 'cause the ministers round in our parts used to preach that the Bible went in for these 'ere cuttings up, and I couldn't be up to 'em with their Greek and Hebrew, and so I took up agin 'em, Bible and all. I never jined the church till I found a minister that was up to 'em, all in Greek and all that, and he said right the contrary, and then I took right hold and jined the church. I did now, fact," said John, who had been all this time uncorking some very frisky bottled cider, which at this juncture he presented. "Ye'd better just put up here now till daylight," said he heartily, "and I'll call up the old woman and have a bed got ready for you in no time." "Thank you, my good friend," said the senator. "I must be along to take the night stage for Columbus." "Ah, well then, if you must, I'll go a piece with you, and show you a crossroad that will take you there better'n the road you came on. That road's mighty bad." John equipped himself, and, with a lantern in hand, was soon seen guiding the senator's carriage towards a road that ran down in a hollow back of his dwelling. When they parted, the senator put into his hand a $10 bill. "It's for her," he said briefly. "Aye, aye," said John with equal conciseness. They shook hands and parted. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10. The
Okay.
property is...
Oops. That's the end of chapter 9. Very, very interesting. Very sorry. Very interesting stuff here. So much, so many directions we can go in. But let me check the board before we go into chapter 10. See what's Papa lacking. Uh, Queen T asked the question, are there let me see here, let me go back. We already spoke about the way in which, even in this narrative, white is colored as good. Malcolm X spoke about it, and everything black is colored as bad. We clearly see it in the way in which it's doing this whole word association thing. Uh, Queen T asked, playing devil's advocate, do you think there were some good white people? I mean, and good is a relative term unless we define it, but historically, definitely there were some melanated European people who were against the idea of slavery and who actually risked their lives to aid in the process of helping melanated people to become free. That's that fact. I know a lot of people may not want to hear that, but it's fact. There's some melanated people who aided in keeping people in slavery, and there was some European people who aided in the thought of helping uh, those who were enslaved to become free. They were an intricate part of the Underground Railroad. You had Quakers who were many of the abolitionists. There's a whole abolitionist movement that was speaking against slavery. And that's what began to make a lot of the noise. It wasn't just, oh, we're going to come down here and look and see, oh, slavery is bad. No, you had European people on the other side of the argument arguing against slavery. You had, like they said, Wilberforce, who was in England. You had the Liberator, which was, now you're gonna make me go look up his name. And that's who Frederick Douglass ultimately, he goes and works with him. The Liberator, his name is, I'm gonna tell you his name right now. That paper came out in the 1830s. William Lloyd Garrison, that's his name. William Lloyd Garrison was beating them in the head, year after year. Frederick Douglass came on board. Many people came on board with the Liberator, which was a paper that ran from 1831 to 1865. And that was why some of the rules against teaching slaves to read came into play during the time before the Civil War, because the Liberator was seen as contraband. It was seen as propagandizing the institution and seeking to start and ignite rebellion, right? And so that was an anti-slavery newspaper that was run and supported by many Europeans. They So this is something that we have to understand. This is why it's very important. Hold on, the phone is ringing. Hold on, I'll call back. Yeah, so this is a very important because some would have us to think it's black and white, and it definitely is not black and white. There are many things in history, and if we're going to be honest and truthful, we have to recount it to the best of our ability and to the best of what's been given us, how it was, and not how we would want it to be to give us an ease of conscience or discussion. Like, definitely you had many European people who put skin in the game for whatever their motivations were. mm. LF says he believes that they were good, they were helping. Yeah, there was many that helped. hmm Let me see here. Okay, y'all are talking. Yeah, the Quaker lady. Yeah, I heard his last wife was a European. Yep, I heard that one too, Frederick Douglass. But when he came in, it was the Liberator Lloyd Garrison. He started speaking on the network. Because they had a whole network of where they would go to different places, churches, meeting halls, and they would have speakers. And one of the things that gave credence to what they were doing was to have people. This is why you had this whole genre of the slave narratives, is because you would bring to your meeting people who actually went through slavery, and this is a first-hand account. And so they brought on like Sojourner Truth, and they brought on Frederick Douglass, and they brought on these people to begin to work the network to raise awareness of what was really happening so that they can push against um, the slavery of the South, because it did become a split, because the South, it was flipped. The South was rich. The South was doing their thing. They had land, they had product. The South was doing their thing. Places like South Carolina, Charleston, places like this, they were doing their thing, and the North, not so much. And I mean, so it was kind of, for whatever, like I said, whatever the motivations for different people was different things. But whatever the motivation was, there were many people um, that did fight on the side of abolition. There's another abolitionist. I'm trying to see, because I remember when I was reading that early on in the slave trade, he spoke against it. His name was George Fox. He was a Quaker. When they came to America, they called them the Friends. They would call them the Friends when they were Quakers. And George Fox was one of them who spoke against. If I could find it again, he spoke against slavery, and he told them like, "Yo, don't do this thing." And this is early on. This wasn't. This was like I think 1600s. It was thereabouts. And he told them early on like, "Yo, don't do this thing. It's not. It's not going to be a good look for you." But they, of course, as we know, history tells us they did it anyway. But that's me getting off topic. So let me get back on topic here. Let's go on to chapter. Yeah, there's Frederick Douglass now out from slavery. Yeah, that's how he ended up running away. I think the young master like kind of stepped to him, or he was pushing up on him, and then I think he got into a tussle, and then he ended up running away from there because you already know once they catch you and you do something of that nature, it's going to be a wrap. So if I'm not mistaken, that's how he ended up running away. So we're gonna go to chapter 10, and then we're gonna go ahead and wind down.
Carried off. The February morning looked gray and drizzling through the window of Uncle Tom's cabin. It looked on downcast faces, the images of mournful hearts. The little table stood out before the fire, covered with an ironing cloth. A coarse but clean shirt or two, fresh from the iron, hung on the back of a chair by the fire, and Aunt Chloe had another spread out before her on the table. Carefully she rubbed and ironed every fold and every hem with the most scrupulous exactness, every now and then raising her hand to her face to wipe off the tears that were coursing down her cheeks. Tom sat by, with his Testament open on his knee and his head leaning upon his hand, but neither spoke. It was yet early, and the children lay all asleep together in their little rude trundle bed. Tom, who had to the full the gentle domestic heart, which woe for them has been a peculiar characteristic of his unhappy race, got up and walked silently to look at his children. "It's the last time," he said. Aunt Chloe did not answer, only rubbed away over and over on the coarse shirt, already as smooth as hands could make it, and finally, setting her iron suddenly down with a despairing plunge, she sat down to the table and lifted up her voice and wept. "Suppose we must be resigned. Oh, but, oh, Lord, how can I? If I'd knowed anything where you're going, or how they'd sarve you, Mrs. says she'll try and deem you in a year or two. But, Lord, nobody never comes up that goes down thar. They kills 'em. I've hearn 'em tell how they works 'em up on them our plantations." "There'll be the same God there, Cleo, that there is here." "Well," said Aunt Cleo, "s'pose there will. But the Lord lets dreadful things happen sometimes. I don't seem to get no comfort that way." "I'm in the Lord's hands," said Tom. "Nothing can go no further than he lets it. And there's one thing I can thank him for. It's me that's sold and going down, and not you nor the children. Here you're safe. What comes will come only on me, and the Lord, he'll help me. I know he will. Ah, brave manly heart, smothering thine own sorrow to comfort thy beloved ones. Tom spoke with a thick utterance, and with a bitter choking in his throat, but he spoke brave and strong. "Let's think on our marcies," he said tremulously, as if he was quite sure he needed to think on them very hard indeed. "Marcies," said Aunt Chloe. "Don't see no marcy. 'Tain't right. 'Tain't right it should be so. Master never ought to left it so that he could be took for his debts. You've arned him all he gets for you, twice over. He owed you your freedom, and ought to get to you years ago. Maybe he can't help himself now, but I feel it's wrong. Nothing can't beat that out of me. Such a faithful critter as you've been, and allers sought his business for your own every way, and reckoned on him more than your own wife and children. Them as sells heart's love and heart's blood to get out thar scrapes, the Lord be up to 'em. Chloe, now, if you love me, you won't talk so, when perhaps just the last time we'll ever have together. And I'll tell you, Chloe, it goes agin me to hear one word agin Massa. Want he put in my arms a baby? It's nature I should think a heap of him, and he couldn't be 'spected to think so much of poor Tom. Massa's used to having all day's year things done for him, and nat'ally they don't think so much on't. They can't be 'spected to, no way. Set up 'longside of other masses, who's had the treatment and living I've had? And he never would have let this yar come on me if he could have seed it aforehand. I know he wouldn't. Well, anyway, there's wrong about somewhere, said Chloe, in whom a stubborn sense of justice was a predominant trait. I can't just make out whar 'tis, but there's wrong somewhere. I'm clear on that. You ought to look up to the Lord above. He's above all. There don't a sparrow fall without him. It don't seem to comfort me, but I 'spect it oughter, said Aunt Chloe. But there's no use talking. I'll just wet up the corn cake and get you one good breakfast, 'cause nobody knows when you'll get another. In order to appreciate the sufferings of the Negroes sold South, it must be remembered that all the instinctive affections of that race are peculiarly strong. Their local attachments are very abiding. They are not naturally daring and enterprising, but home-loving and affectionate. Add to this all the terrors with which ignorance invests the unknown, and add to this, again, that selling to the South is set before the Negro from childhood as the last severity of punishment. The threat that terrifies more than whipping or torture of any kind is the threat of being sent down river. We have ourselves heard this feeling expressed by them, and seen the unaffected horror with which they will sit in their gossiping hours and tell frightful stories of that down river, which to them is that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Note, a slightly inaccurate quotation from Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1, lines 369 to 370. A missionary figure among the fugitives in Canada told us that many of the fugitives confessed themselves to have escaped from comparatively kind masters, and that they were induced to brave the perils of escape in almost every case by the desperate horror with which they regarded being sold South, a doom which was hanging either over themselves or their husbands, their wives, or children. This nerves the African, naturally patient, timid, and unenterprising, with heroic courage, and leads him to suffer hunger, cold, pain, the perils of the wilderness, and the more dread penalties of recapture. The simple morning meal now smoked on the table, for Mrs. Shelby had excused Aunt Chloe's attendance at the great house that morning. The poor soul had expended all her little energies on this farewell feast, had killed and dressed her choicest chicken, and prepared her corn cake with scrupulous exactness, just to her husband's taste, and brought out certain mysterious jars on the mantelpiece, some preserves that were never produced except on extreme occasions. "Lord, Pete," said Mose triumphantly, "hadn't we got a buster of a breakfast?" at the same time catching at a fragment of the chicken. Aunt Chloe gave him a sudden box on the ear. "There now, crowing over the last breakfast your poor daddy's going to have to home." "Oh, Chloe," said Tom gently. "Well, I can't help it," said Aunt Chloe, hiding her face in her apron. "I's so tossed about it, it makes me act ugly." The boys stood quite still, looking first at their father and then at their mother, while the baby, climbing up her clothes, began an imperious, commanding cry. "Thar," said Aunt Chloe, wiping her eyes and taking up the baby. "Now I's done, I hope. Now do eat something. This here's my nicest chicken. Thar, boys, ye shall have some, poor critters. Your mammy's been cross to yer." The boys needed no second invitation and went in with great zeal for the eatables, and it was well they did so, as otherwise there would have been very little performed to any purpose by the party. "Now," said Aunt Chloe, bustling about after breakfast, "I must put up your clothes. Just like as not he'll take 'em all away. I know their ways, mean as dirt they is. Well, now, your flannels for rheumatiz is in this corner, so be careful, 'cause there won't nobody make you no more. Then here's your old shirts, and these yere is new ones. I towed off these your stockings last night, and put the ball in 'em to mend with, but Lor, who'll ever mend for you?" And Aunt Chloe, again overcome, laid her head on the box side and sobbed. "To think on it, no critter to do for you, sick or well. I don't rarely think I ought to be good now." The boys, having eaten everything there was on the breakfast table, began now to take some thought of the case, and seeing their mother crying and their father looking very sad, began to whimper and put their hand to their eyes. Uncle Tom had the baby on his knee and was letting her enjoy herself to the utmost extent, scratching his face and pulling his hair, and occasionally breaking out into clamorous explosions of delight, evidently arising out of her own internal reflections. "Ah, crow away, poor critter," said Aunt Chloe. "You'll have to come to it, too. You'll live to see your husband sold, or maybe be sold yourself. And these yer boys, they's to be sold, I suppose, too, just like as not. When day gets good for something, ain't no use in niggers having nothing."
Whew. Aunt Chloe is salty. She's making sure she's salt baying the whole conversation. She's salt baying the children. She's salt baying the husband. But this is how we are seeing the beginnings of a mentality, a thought, an action that shapes a mentality, that shapes how generations of people think. Listen to what she's saying. She has one day to adjust to this reality of the fact that her husband is sold and she can do nothing about it. When her will would be for him to run, to escape, to be free. He is so trauma bonded to his oppressor, that's Tom, that he refuses because his thought is that not only is it going to affect me, it's going to affect everybody who is here. So I'll take the hit. This is what he's saying. And she is in her feelings about that. She's like, I don't see nothing good about this. And so now, sorry, it wasn't enough for it to stop there. She then turns to the next generation, which are her children, because they're saying he's there sitting in his last moments with the children. She can't contain herself. She can't hold it inside anymore. So she's projecting this doomed fate onto her children, that there's no use. You're going to end up like your daddy. You're going to end up like your father, and you're going to become a nothing, and they're going to sell you. Listen to the terminology. Listen to what she's saying. We see some of that very same um, disparaging behavior, hopeless behavior in today's space and time, when the woman feels powerless and she feels unprotected and she feels violated, then she turns to the next generation, unfortunately, and you hear them cursing the next generation, cursing her seed, saying, telling them that their father is nothing. So this is deep. That's what I'm saying. It's deep, and we see how hopelessness, how it transfers and how then it embeds into that young mind that's hearing and seeing this last scene. And then, that person tells their children, and then that person tells their children, and it passes down um, throughout the generations. It's kind of wild. But Aunt Chloe's turned up right now, and she's supposed to be the stereotypical mammy character. She gets up, she makes him the whole cakes the way he likes it. She does all that, but she's salty. She's getting really upset and angry, and she doesn't know what to do with it. And on top of that, she's gonna be left. She's gonna be left with the people who sold her husband. So, figure that with the young children, knowing that she may never see him again. Yes, you see a lot of that when the father and the spouses go to jail. Yes, Queen T, exactly. You see this very same spirit, this very same energy revisited of you're leaving me with all the responsibility, and he's like, you caping for him, and you did everything right. You did everything they asked you to, and he was you worth way more than this, because you were supposed to been had your freedom, and you're still holding on to the person who oppressed you, and now the person who's exploiting you. So she's rightfully. So a lot of people say, back to the angry black woman syndrome revisited. A lot of people say, well, why is she angry? Now you can see the seed of her anger. What birthed the generations that would later come to what you're calling angry black woman syndrome. Things like this. But I'll continue because we just got a little bit more to go.
Here one of the boys called out, "There's Missus a-comin' in. She can't do no good. What's she comin' for?" said Aunt Chloe. Mrs. Shelby entered. Aunt Chloe set a chair for her in a manner decidedly gruff and crusty. She did not seem to notice either the action or the manner. She looked pale and anxious. "Tom," she said. "I come to—" And stopping suddenly and regarding the silent group, she sat down in the chair and, covering her face with her handkerchief, began to sob. "Lord, now, Mrs., don't," said Aunt Chloe, bursting out in her turn, and for a few moments they all wept in company. And in those tears they all shed together, the high and the lowly, melted away all the heart-burnings and anger of the oppressed. O ye who visit the distressed, do ye know that everything your money can buy, given with a cold, averted face, is not worth one honest tear shed in real sympathy? "My good fellow," said Mrs. Shelby, "I can't give you anything to do you any good. If I give you money, it will only be taken from you. But I tell you solemnly and before God that I will keep trace of you and bring you back as soon as I can command the money. Until then, trust in God." Here the boys called out that Massa Haley was coming, and then an unceremonious kick pushed open the door. Haley stood there in very ill humor, having ridden hard the night before, and being not at all pacified by his ill success in recapturing his prey. "Come," said he. "You nigger, you're ready?" "Servant, ma'am," said he, taking off his hat as he saw Mrs. Shelby. Aunt Chloe shut and corded the box, and getting up, looked gruffly on the trader, her tears seeming suddenly turned to sparks of fire. Tom rose up meekly to follow his new master, and raised up his heavy box on his shoulder. His wife took the baby in her arms to go with him to the wagon, and the children, still crying, trailed on behind. Mrs. Shelby, walking up to the trader, detained him for a few moments, talking with him in an earnest manner, and while she was thus talking, the whole family party proceeded to a wagon that stood ready harnessed at the door. A crowd of all the old and young hands on the place stood gathered around it to bid farewell to their old associate. Tom had been looked up to, both as a head servant and a Christian teacher, by all the place, and there was much honest sympathy and grief about him, particularly among the women. "Why, Chloe, you buy it better'n we do," said one of the women, who had been weeping freely, noticing the gloomy calmness with which Aunt Chloe stood by the wagon. "I's done my tears," she said, looking grimly at the trader, who was coming up. "I does not feel to cry for that our old limb, nohow." "Get in," said Haley to Tom, as he strode through the crowd of servants who looked at him with lowering brows. Tom got in, and Haley, drawing out from under the wagon seat a heavy pair of shackles, made them fast around each ankle. A smothered groan of indignation ran through the whole circle, and Mrs. Shelby spoke from the veranda. "Mr. Haley, I assure you that precaution is entirely unnecessary." "Don't know, ma'am. I've lost $500 from this yar place, and I can't afford to run no more risks." "What else could she spect on him?" said Aunt Chloe indignantly, while the two boys, who now seemed to comprehend at once their father's destiny, clung to her gown, sobbing and growing vehemently. "I'm sorry," said Tom, "that Massa George happened to be away." George had gone to spend 2 or 3 days with a companion on a neighboring estate, and having departed early in the morning, before Tom's misfortune had been made public, had left without hearing of it. "Give my love to Massa George," he said earnestly. Haley whipped up the horse, and with a steady, mournful look, fixed to the last on the old place, Tom was whirled away. Mr. Shelby at this time was not at home. He had sold Tom under the spur of a driving necessity to get out of the power of a man whom he dreaded, and his first feeling after the consummation of the bargain had been that of relief, but his wife's expostulations awoke his half-slumbering regrets, and Tom's manly disinterestedness increased the unpleasantness of his feelings. It was in vain that he said to himself that he had a right to do it, that everybody did it, and that some did it without even the excuse of necessity. He could not satisfy his own feelings, and that he might not witness the unpleasant scenes of the consummation, he had gone on a short business tour up the country, hoping that all would be over before he returned. Tom and Haley rattled on along the dusty road, whirling past every old familiar spot, until the bounds of the estate were fairly passed, and they found themselves out on the open pike. After they had ridden about a mile, Haley suddenly drew up at the door of a blacksmith's shop, when, taking out with him a pair of handcuffs, he stepped into the shop to have a little alteration in them. "These yers a little too small for his build," said Haley, showing the fetters and pointing out to Tom. "Lord, now, if thar ain't Shelby's Tom! He hadn't sold him now," said the smith. "Yes, he has," said Haley. "Now you don't." "Well, really," said the smith. "Who'd have thought it? Why, you needn't go to fetterin' him up this yar way. He's the faithfulest, best creetur—" "Yes, yes," said Haley, "but your good fellers are just the critter to want her run off. Them stupid ones as don't care where they go, and shiftless drunken ones as don't care for nothing, they'll stick by, and like as not be rather pleased to be toted around. But they's yar prime fellers, they hates it like sin. No way but to fetter 'em. Got legs? They'll use 'em, no mistake." "Well," said the smith, feeling among his tools, "them plantations down thar, stranger, ain't just the place a Kentuck nigger wants to go to. They dies thar tolerable fast, don't they?" "Well, yes, tolerable fast their dying is. What with the climatin' and one thing and another, and they dies so as to keep the market up pretty brisk," said Haley. "Well, a feller can't help thinking it's a mighty pity to have a nice, quiet, likely feller, as good as Tom is, go down to be fairly ground up on one of them thar sugar plantations." "Well, he's got a fair chance. I promise to do well by him. I'll get him in house servant in some good old family, and then, if he stands the fever and climatin', he'll have a berth good as any nigger ought to ask for." "He leaves his wife and children up there, I suppose?" "Yes, he'll get another thar. Lord, thar's women enough everywhere," said Haley. Tom was sitting very mournfully on the outside of the shop while this conversation was going on. Suddenly he heard the quick, short click of a horse's hoof behind him, and before he could fairly wake from his surprise, young Master George sprang into the wagon, threw his arms tumultuously round his neck, and was sobbing and scolding with energy. "I declare it's real mean. I don't care what they say, any of them. It's a nasty, mean shame. If I was a man, they shouldn't do it. They should not. So," said George with a kind of subdued howl. "Oh, Massa George, this does me good," said Tom. "I couldn't bar to go off without seeing you. It does me real good. You can't tell." Here Tom made some movement of his feet, and George's eye fell on the fetters. "What a shame!" he exclaimed, lifting his hands. "I'll knock that old fellow down, I will." "No, you won't, Massa George, and you must not talk so loud. It won't help me any to anger him." "Well, I won't then, for your sake, but only to think of it, isn't it a shame? They never sent for me, nor sent me any word, and if it hadn't been for Tom Lincoln, I shouldn't have heard it. I tell you, I blew 'em up well, all of 'em at home." "Thar wasn't right, I'm feared, Massa Tom." "Can't help it. I say it's a shame. Look here, Uncle Tom," said he, turning his back to the shop and speaking in a mysterious tone, "I've brought you my $1. "Oh, I wouldn't think of taking on't, Massa George. No ways in the world," said Tom, quite moved. "But you shall take it," said George. "Look here, I told Aunt Chloe I'd do it, and she advised me just to make a hole in it and put a string through it so you would hang it round your neck and keep it out of sight, else this mean scamp would take it away. I tell you, Tom, I want to blow him up. It would do me good." "No, don't, Massa George, for it won't do me any good." "Well, I won't, for your sake," said George, busily tying his dollar round Tom's neck. "But there, now, button your coat tight over it, and keep it, and remember, every time you see it, that I'll come down after you and bring you back. Aunt Chloe and I have been talking about it, and I told her not to fear. I'll see to it, and I'll tease father's life out if he don't do it." "Oh, Massa George, you mustn't talk so about your father." "Lord, Uncle Tom, I don't mean anything bad." "And now, Massa George," said Tom, "ye must be a good boy. Remember how many hearts is sot on you. Allus keep close to your mother. Don't be getting into any of them foolish ways boys has of getting too big to mind their mothers. Tell you what, Massa George, the Lord gives good many things twice over, but he won't give you a mother but once. You'll never see such another woman, Massa George, if you live to be 100 years old. So now you hold on to her and grow up and be a comfort to her. There's my own good boy. You will now, won't you?" "Yes, I will, Uncle Tom," said George seriously. "And be careful of your speaking, Massa George. Young boys, when it comes to your age, is willful sometimes. It is nature they should be. But real gentlemen, such as I hopes you'll be, never lets fall on words that isn't 'spectful to their parents. You ain't 'fended, Massa George?" "No, indeed, Uncle Tom. You always did give me good advice." "I's older, you know," said Tom, stroking the boy's fine curly head with his large strong hand, but speaking in a voice as tender as a woman's, "and I sees all that's bound up in you. Oh, Massa George, you has everything. Larnin', privileges, readin', writin'. And you'll grow up to be a great, learned, good man, and all the people on the place and your mother and father be so proud on you. Be a good massa, like your father, and be a Christian, like your mother. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, Massa George." "I'll be real good, Uncle Tom, I tell you," said George. "I'm going to be a first-rater, and don't you be discouraged. I'll have you back to the place yet. As I told Aunt Chloe this morning, I'll build our house all over, and you shall have a room for a parlor with a carpet on it when I'm a man. Oh, you'll
Oops, sorry.
have good times yet." Haley now came to the door with the handcuffs in his hands. "Look here now, mister," said George with an air of great superiority as he got out. "I shall let father and mother know how you treat Uncle Tom." "You're welcome," said the trader. "I should think you'd be ashamed to spend all your life buying men and women and chaining them like cattle. I should think you'd feel mean," said George. "So long as your grand folks wants to buy men and women, I'm as good as they is," said Haley. "'Tain't any meaner selling on 'em than 'tis buying." "I'll never do either when I'm a man," said George. "I'm ashamed this day that I'm a Kentuckian. I always was proud of it before." And George sat very straight on his horse and looked round with an air as if he expected the state would be impressed with his opinion. "Well, goodbye, Uncle Tom. Keep a stiff upper lip," said George. "Goodbye, Master George," said Tom, looking fondly and admiringly at him. "God Almighty bless you. Ah, Kentucky hadn't got many like you," he said in the fullness of his heart, as the frank, boyish face was lost to his view. Away he went, and Tom looked till the clatter of his horse's heels died away, the last sound or sight of his home. But over his heart there seemed to be a warm spot where those young hands had placed that precious dollar. Tom put up his hand and held it close to his heart. "Now, I tell you what, Tom," said Haley as he came up to the wagon and threw in the handcuffs. "I mean to start far with you, as I generally do with my niggers. I'll tell you now, to begin with, you treat me fair, and I'll treat you fair. I ain't never hard on my niggers. Calculates to do the best for 'em I can. Now, you see, you better just settle down comfortable and not be trying no tricks, because niggers' tricks of all sorts I'm up to, and it's no use. If niggers is quiet and don't try to get off, they has good times with me, and if they don't, why, it's their fault and not mine." Tom assured Haley that he had no present intentions of running off. In fact, the exhortation seemed rather a superfluous one to a man with a great pair of iron fetters on his feet. But Mr. Haley had got in the habit of commencing his relations with his stock with little exhortations of this nature, calculated, as he deemed, to inspire cheerfulness and confidence, and prevent the necessity of any unpleasant scenes. And here, for the present, we take our leave of Tom to pursue the fortunes of other characters in our story. End of chapter 10.
All right, that's the end of chapter 10. Dude won't stop talking about the ninja tricks. I don't know why. Oh my goodness, it's late. He stay yo dude got you. I mean, he has him fettered. What ninja tricks is he gonna pull, brother? I mean, come on, like real concern. And we see this concern even in today's space and time. The man could be, he could be handcuffed, foot cuffed, straight jacket, and thought is like he moved. It's like, dude, how did he move? So it's this real and present fear. Like I said, we see it even in today's space and time, and we see deadly force being used because of the fear of ninja tricks, whatever that is, right? Ninja? Why you got to use that word? You got some tricks? Yeah. So, um, Yeah, he has chains on. He has chains on, and Haley is still um because when you look at what is going on, and then Queen T says that she thinks Tom is on the coon train, and that even though people don't clearly speak about what being an Uncle Tom is, that is the insinuation. So that's why I think just taking the time and kind of combing through this narrative helps even me just get more clarity on the character of Tom so far. Y'all let me know. Yeah, thoughts. And then I have one more thing to share because I found something. If he was gonna run, he would have left. Correct. Yeah, Haley. Haley likes, yeah, because that's another one of the words that they like to put people in there, to try to put you down. But exactly, if he was gonna run, he would have run already. But what I'm saying is, mm, even like today's space and time, you have different personalities. You have different character traits. You have different temperaments. Like even in this story, how they're describing Andy is different from Sam, is different from Tom, is different from George. You have different temperaments. And so Tom doesn't appear to be the dude who got energy for all of that. So he seems to me, A, that he has a trauma bond with his Shelby, number one. And number two, he doesn't appear to have the energy for all the rah-rah. In order for you, it's not, it's like coming off the plantation, leaving, like physically coming off the plantation, or leaving your job to go become an entrepreneur. It's not necessarily for the faint at heart. It's not that means that you're less than. It just means that it's not an easy road. It's the description of the road that they were describing with the bump and the mud it's not an easy road. And some people would rather not. And to me, Tom sounds like the person who would rather not. That's just me. Like, I'm gonna tell you how to come, but I'm not gonna do all that rah-rah business. Because a lot of people who run off, they have to have the will to stay off. Because some would run off and next thing you know, they get hungry or they get tired and they peeping in the bush talking about pss, pss, pss. And there has been narratives like that. Like they might run off for a week or a month, they in the bush. And then the other slaves who still on the plantation got to give them food and stuff, and then eventually they come back, you know because it takes something to be able to survive, the will to survive outside of that. And some people have been broken beyond, and we don't know, I don't remember if they told us how old Tom was, but he sounded like he a little bit tired. Yeah. Yeah, you had some who were real rebellious and who had that kind of energy. How old is Tom? That's what I was trying to say, LF. I don't remember how old is Tom in the story, but he sounded like that dude that is not about that life. Tom sound like, man, forget all that. Y'all tripping. Ain't nobody running nowhere. He's like Chloe, have several seats. Ain't nobody running nowhere. um, Speaking about were there any good quote Europeans? I just mentioned George Fox, so I'm just going to share a little bit about the abolition project. Quakers, that's what I was remembering. The Friends, I said they would call them Friends. There were a lot of the people who became abolitionists. So the abolition campaign in Britain was started by the Society of Friends known as the Quakers. Quakers believe that all people are created equal in the eyes of God. And if this is the case, then how can one person own another? The beginning of the Quakers' opposition came in 1657. This is what I was trying to find. So this is why I'm reading it. When their founder George Fox wrote to friends beyond sea that have blacks and Indian slaves, end quote, to remind them of Quaker beliefs in equality, sorry. He later visited Barbados, and his preaching, which urged for better treatment of enslaved people, was published in London in 1676 under the title Gospel Family Order. He said, oh, let's listen to the extract. Uh, I'm that person today. Hold on. Let's see what he said, y'all. Where did it go? Okay, I'm not downloading nothing. I guess I'll read what he said because I'm not downloading it. Um, In 2 seconds. I'm sorry. Now I say, if this should be the condition of you and yours, you would think it hard measure, yea, and very great bondage and cruelty, and therefore consider seriously of this, and do you for and to them, as you would willingly have them or any other to do unto you. Were you in the like slavish condition? So this is what he was writing. It says around 1727, the Quakers began to express their official disapproval of the trade and promote reforms. From the 1750s, a number of Quakers in the American colonies began to oppose enslavement. This is 1750s. This is before America became independent, right? They visited the slaveholders and lobbied the English headquarters for action. By 1761, Quakers had come to view abolition as a Christian duty, and all Quakers on both sides of the Atlantic were barred from owning slaves. Any members that did not conform were disowned. And they even went as far as to any products that came or were associated with slave labor, they didn't use it either. But in 1783, the London Society of Friends yearly meeting presented a petition against the slave trade, signed by nearly 300 Quakers to Parliament. They subsequently decided to set up a formal committee to consider the slave trade, as well as an informal group of 6 Quakers who pioneered the British abolitionist movement. And that the British abolitionist movement is what got the slave trade halted in 18, I believe, 1808 or 1807, 1808, thereabouts, where they abolished the international slave trade. Or, you know, it says here they later decided to form a small group open to all denominations to gain wider Anglican and parliamentary support. And then it goes on, you can definitely read it. I'll just put it in the box. But that's what I was referring to with the question of whether or not they were, quote, good white people. There were Europeans who understood that what was being done was going to be problematic, and they expressed it at that time, even before it came to what it was. Yes, yeah. Josiah Henson is Tom's real character. We can listen to that at another time. It's not as long, and he did end up going to I listened to it online. I listened to the audio book. And so, yeah, that's when we finish listening to this, we could look at the inspiration for Tom's character, which is Josiah Henson. Correct, 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 correct. So, with that said, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Hold on, wait, I didn't put the thing back. I'm like, oh, there you go. I'm like, why is the screen looking like that? I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I know it's not an easy read, and like I said, sometimes that's why it can become too much. So I do about 2 chapters if they're not that long, because her flowery words sometimes get to you. You know what I mean? But as long as we learn and we grow, and we have more information that we can have informed conversations, it's worth it. So thank you for going into the trenches with me and making our way through this. We'll come back and do where we at. We halfway through the first part, y'all, because we at 4 hours in. Yay! So we'll come back and do 12 and 13, and see if we can learn a little bit more about Tom's character and see what happens to Chloe. Does she become an angry so-called black woman? I don't know. Dum dum dum. See, where's Eliza? What's going on with Eliza? Will she make it to Canada? Yes, thank you again, Queen T. Thumbs up before leaving and share. It's important. It helps us to be informed, you know. So once again, thank everybody for tuning in. We'll talk again. It's bedtime, y'all. All right.